The ICRC is not a judicial authority. We're not a state. We don't have weapons. We're not a political body. We're not a religious body. We're not a judicial body.
That's very true, but the International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC, is one of the largest humanitarian organizations with a huge presence in the war-torn countries like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And in those places, one of the ICRC's key roles is to help make sure that international humanitarian law is respected during armed conflicts.
But in Sudan, access for humanitarian organizations to deliver aid is still being curtailed.
We call on humanitarian organizations to support the people here. We also ask them to recognize that women face particular challenges and that we urgently need services tailored to us.
But beyond distributing food, water, and medical supplies, the question is, how can humanitarian organizations actually support conflict resolution?
And especially when communities don't see a heavy presence of these bodies as something that dispels fear and anxiety.
Even though they are expressing their anxiety and fear about the situation, they still need us as UNMISS to increase our footprint, our patrol, and to continue engage with them closely.
So certainly humanitarian bodies don't end conflicts in the way that United Nations-led peace processes do, but they can influence the political climate in African conflicts.
And that's exactly what we will unpack today under the Baobab.
Always a pleasure
I'm moved always by prompts of, affirmation, and that includes you telling me to start.
Go ahead.
All right. Hello and a very warm welcome. My name is Okachi, and this is Under the Baobab. I'm glad to have you around.
And I am Mefo Newuh. It's always a pleasure having you with us, and always a pleasure with you, George.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm here under the Baobab, where we make Africa's complex issues personal and relatable.
Yes, we do that every Friday. We talk with policymakers, politicians, and African leaders to dig into issues that matter the most to you. And here is what makes this show very special. You, our viewer or listener, can be part of the conversation. And what you only need to do is to subscribe to our YouTube channel,
DW Africa, where we can see that the community is growing very rapidly.
Yes.
With your reactions. We enjoy all the comments when we look at them every week. So today, George,
yes,
we are going to be talking about the ongoing conflicts in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also other armed conflicts in Africa. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, Africa accounts for roughly 40% of all armed conflicts worldwide. That's a lot.
That's huge, Mimi. And what our viewers must understand, that these wars are becoming more longer and more fragmented and tied to humanitarian collapse. And that's why today we are speaking with James Reynolds, the ICRC's Deputy Director of Africa. He is just returned from some of these conflict zones, seeing firsthand how ICRC is coping with the humanitarian consequences of these wars.
It's always a pleasure, to speak with someone who's seen it firsthand. Also in Cameroon, we have a conflict that's been raging for 10 years now and counting. And when we're talking about humanitarian collapse, it's important to put it in context.
Very important.
These conflicts have caused an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 deaths, according to the Norway-based Peace Research Institute Oslo. And violence has also displaced roughly 35 million people in Africa today. That's a lot of numbers.
A lot is an understatement, Mimi, in my view. And it's huge. And when we talk about 35 million people being displaced, being forced out of their normal homes, it's like talking about the entire population of Cameroon, your country.
Even more.
Or even Ghana.
More than
or Angola.
In Cameroon, yes.
Yeah, imagine all these people being bundled out from their country.
Right. And usually I always have the impression that because of inaccessibility to some remote areas, also because the insecurity in some areas, it becomes very challenging to get the real data that we have on the ground.
So it could be higher.
It could even be more. And for those displaced and caught in armed conflict, the simple wish is for them to see an end to this war that is ravaging their localities. And they are tired of the speeches, the statements from governments, from international bodies like the UN, even African Union. They simply just want peace and stability.
Yes, and they want to return home. Some of them have, expressed such a feeling. And the responsibility to end a conflict or a war, an armed conflict, is always to the warring factions. That includes the leaders who are involved in, embroiled in the war itself.
Right.
But also, organizations like the African Union or the United Nations can always be called to mediate. But I always wonder, we have, humanitarian organizations who have access, and who are, collaborating with the communities just to make sure that they have the provision of essential, services. Do they have a role in trying to end, or rather in conflict resolution in these countries?
In this case, we are talking about the ICRC, right?
Yes.
The Red Cross Committee. They've been doing quite a lot. And when we look at mediation, usually international bodies like the African Union, the UN, are always not trusted by the communities, the villagers, the people affected by conflict. And these, humanitarian bodies come like some sort of that shield, that only organization that people believe in, that people trust. But the question now is, how invested are they into seeing that some of these conflicts end, other than offering humanitarian assistance? Is that something that you discuss with the ICRC's director?
Yes, I had that discussion, and I started by asking him, what are people actually telling him when he is on the ground in these conflict zones?
I think personally what strikes me, what always struck me a lot when I lived in South Sudan, and what I saw when I was there this last week, is just the immense courage and solidarity that people who have very little economically, and then they're displaced and they lose what little they have. And they're welcomed by neighbours, neighbouring villages, people in a little bit further down the river. International actors like the ICRC, we do what we can, but there's an awful lot of solidarity and commitment and sacrifice on the part of the people in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, and elsewhere. So I think that's probably the strongest sort of sense I take when I was travelling recently.
One thing is for sure, they must be holding hope that the violence will end so they can finally go home, James. But I can imagine some believe the Red Cross can actually stop the war. Do you ever feel helpless knowing you can only do so much?
Helpless, no. I've worked for a long time for the ICRC, and I believe in what we do, and I was really struck by the dedication of our teams and what they do manage to achieve in terms of protecting people from the worst effects of conflict, from assisting people who've lost everything, from trying to provide surgical care for people who've been wounded, bullet wounds or burn wounds. That's really encouraging for me, and it's important to see that every now and then. So I certainly don't lose hope. It is true that probably something like 40% of the conflicts around the world today are on the African continent. That puts a particular burden on people that, it's not just the sort of a 2 or 3 weeks of conflict and then back to normal, but it's a kind of having to live with this protracted conflict. And I think the courage and that people show is really something that certainly gives me hope.
Yes, James, and I'm glad you are still hopeful. But in Sudan's long, brutal conflict, what concrete step has your organization urged both the Sudanese army and the RSF commanders to take after those documented violations? And how can we track compliance?
As you may be aware, we have a lot of bilateral and confidential dialogue with all the parties in the conflict, both the SAF in Port Sudan, as well as with the RSF in Darfur. Our colleagues are on the ground, working out of offices around what is a very big country, and we really go to great lengths to document what we see and then raise those issues with the authorities, with arms carriers across the country, and really impress upon them the moral and the legal requirement they have to make sure they treat civilians properly during a conflict. We can't disclose what we discuss with them, but be assured we take those kinds of violations very seriously and really bring as much argumentative force as we can to them.
Great. Now let's talk about international humanitarian law, which is also known as the IHL. At its core, these laws are a set of rules that govern how wars and armed conflicts should be fought. But the main goal is also to limit suffering for those who are not fighting, or those who have stopped fighting the war.
Yes. Yeah. And IHL tries to strike a balance between military necessity and humanitarian protection. protection. But bodies like ICRC have repeatedly reported, violations. And let's take, for example, Sudan. Just as recent as yesterday, we were talking about, hospital bombings.
But it's very clear, bodies like the ICRC, we know that they don't have any power to kind of prosecute. But how is it working to make sure that violations of international humanitarian laws that we've just talked about don't go unpunished? Because we see that every day in war zones.
Yes, I just wanted to have more understanding of what, governs this IHL. And I put the same accountability question to James Reynolds.
Listen, what's important under the Geneva Conventions, what's important is that civilians are spared as far as possible the effects of conflict. We've worked alongside water technicians in different parts of the country to enable them to kind of maintain water systems, so that works still. But what we see is a country that's facing probably the worst or the largest displacement crisis in the world at the moment. More than 13 million Sudanese have been displaced either within the country or have left the country to become refugees. And probably 2/3 of the population is without access to good medical care. So the eyes of the world really need to be on Sudan. And I'm very happy we can speak a little bit about the work we do there with you today, George.
Right, and let's dig into that further. With those grave breaches like, hospital bombings, what mechanisms does the ICRC prioritize to ensure individual commanders are held personally responsible?
The ICRC is not a judicial authority. We're not a state. We don't have weapons.
Well, I'd be surprised if your team had weapons.
Yeah. Ultimately, states are responsible for accountability for the actions of their agents. Clearly, attacks on hospitals are something that is forbidden under the Geneva Conventions. It's a global campaign the ICRC has, and it's a key part of the representations we make to the different parties in Sudan.
But clearly, they are not listening. And I'm saying that because the UN says over 500 civilians have already been killed in drone strikes in Sudan this year alone, James. How do you even begin to respond to that?
I think sometimes they do, not as often as we would like. We are able to sort of provide some kind of substitute access to medical health services alongside other Sudanese and international actors. But we need to keep that pressure on, and others need to do that as well, in order to convince people that health care needs to be preserved.
Well, I'm sure that's the same situation in South Sudan. And when victims see you during your visits, they must believe you can also help them get reparations. What do you say when they ask you those questions, James, directly?
We work very closely with the African Union and have done for 3 decades now. So the rules are there. I think most people understand the rules. What I think is important is ensuring respect for those rules. And that's something, we really leave no stone unturned in our dialogue in South Sudan and in other countries. But we still see many civilians who are displaced by the consequences of conflict. The disruption that war causes has a pretty heavy price on people. We see a high level of food insecurity in South Sudan. So really important to kind of keep pushing those messages, both in terms of practical dialogue in South Sudan, as well as through organs like the African Union and some of the regional economic groups around the continent.
Mimi, I can recall I once reported at the Dadaab refugee camp that is in northeastern Kenya. That's many years ago. And it's one of the largest refugee settlements in the world. People there come from Somalia, war-torn regions within Somalia and come to Kenya. And what struck me a lot is that when we were just arriving there, people look at you as if you are their lifeline.
Right.
They have that expectation that maybe perhaps you can be of, some sort of, certain help for them.
Right, because they always see, and that's one way in which displaced people, they always see humanitarian aid and organizations. They always feel like, could this be an end? Can we finally go home and live our lives normally? However, not everyone would agree that foreign humanitarian missions are good. There's been a lot of suspicions and also reports. A notorious example is is MONUSCO, the UN's long-running mission in the DRC that was forced to withdraw prematurely. That was about 2 years ago in 2024.
Yeah, that's right. And widespread demonstrations and indeed attacks on UN personnel in Eastern DRC followed that narrative that UN was ineffective. They've been there for a long time, but people are not seeing the benefit, of that entity.
And there's always a lot of question mark. And another argument was that more Congolese national agency and ownership of the peace building process was required, which raises an important point here, George. There comes a time when victims, of armed conflict want someone or some institutions to be held accountable for their situation. They want someone to be able to respond to the questions.
Yes.
Some of these questions that you're putting to the Red Cross Committee director.
Yes.
They want at least someone to give them that hope
That's
that
true.
they don't get to see every day.
Yes, and when it comes to accountability and especially the role of humanitarian bodies beyond just, supply of essentials, our correspondent Zanem Neti Zaidi in DRC spoke to some Congolese citizens. We also gathered reactions from displaced people in Sudan and South Sudan. Since many of them don't speak English, we will hear their voiceover expressions of what they told us.
We call on humanitarian organizations to support the people here. We also ask them to recognize that women face particular challenges and that we urgently need services tailored to us.
Our fear in this camp is that there is no security at all. I fled with my 8 children without their father. All these children are my responsibility. They cannot go to school because of fear.
Because the Red Cross is among the organizations capable of working in both secure and insecure areas. It should be able to collect a great deal of data and produce reports so that perpetrators are brought to justice and victims are restored with their rights once the state resumes its responsibilities.
The ICRC was created to ensure that states and parties to conflicts respect the standards for the protection of people who are no longer participating in armed conflicts. That is its primary role. The humanitarian assistance aspect is somewhat secondary. Therefore, what can be expected from these organizations is that they be present to document cases so that such cases do not go unpunished. This would also ensure that victims who are initially assisted through humanitarian aid can later obtain justice and have access to effective reparations through courts and tribunals.
Yeah, so it's clear, Mimi, that there is, a general expectation that, humanitarian organizations can do more, other than, supplying food, water, and medical, care services to, affected people. And the last, voices we've heard from, the Congo, it speaks to the war in that particular country. And it remains one of, Africa's most complex, war. It's a protracted war. And as of this year, Mimi, we're still talking about this war intensifying.
I remember when I was covering the Munich Security Conference 1 year exactly.
Yes, I remember that time, yeah.
We're at the heart of this conflict, and we thought that by now things must have maybe ended, or maybe they would have reached a deal to see how to end the infighting. But it's not ended. And according to recent report, fighting between the Congolese army and the M23 rebel movement has escalated sharply. In fact, the M23 keeps, taking over some cities, some localities, and some areas in the country. And over 7 million people have been displaced, making it one of the world's largest internal displacement crisis that we have today. And millions are living in temporary camps, temporary locations, in hidings, or even in the forest. So when I think about this, I can't just help but wonder, what about young children who are supposed to be going to school, women who are supposed to be living their lives normally, especially even pregnant women, young boys and girls. I can't help but just think about what their future would look like. I mean, in the next 5-10 10 years.
That's difficult to even imagine, Mimi. And as I was trying to do research, we were doing the research together about, this particular interview with the ICRC. And the body says that latest humanitarian outlook of 2026 describes Congo, the DRC that is, along Sudan, as part of the continent succumbing to war.
Right.
And millions of lives live in areas controlled or contested by armed groups. As you've said, the M23 is taking over some territories, meaning that rules to protect, people cannot be adhered to sometimes because maybe there is no even access to monitor compliance to, international humanitarian law.
But that only tells us that things are not going well. It only tells us that it's deepening. The conflict is deepening. It requires humanitarian organizations coming together to see how to put an end to conflicts like this. And not just providing humanitarian aid, because they do reports, right? They write statements.
Yes.
They issue statements, even though they don't publicize them sometimes.
Yeah.
But they can, in a way, work with these bodies to see how to end the conflict. That has always been the question.
Yeah, and it's the same question I put to Reynolds.
Similarly, I think to what I was saying about Sudan, we have a strong delegation in the capital in Kinshasa and a real well-developed field presence in Goma, in Beni, in North Kivu, in Bukavu, in Uvira, in South Kivu. We see a lot of sexual violence. We see a lot of displacement. Many people have fled out of Congo into Burundi, and that brings up problems for the neighboring countries. So it is a challenge, but I think we do have a very privileged dialogue that we appreciate in Kinshasa and in other parts of the country. So important that remains the case.
Well, James, I want to believe that you report all these violations, but how can the ICRC actually help push for sanctions or prosecutions to deter future breaches of international humanitarian law?
We're not a political body, we're not a religious body, we're not a judicial body. So we're not facilitating sanctions or prosecutions. I think that there are other...
Maybe what you document and report can be used later to, support sanctions against those responsible for these violations. Isn't that part of your process?
No, that's not something we do. And I think it's important for our principles are very much, we have confidential bilateral dialogue in Kinshasa with the authorities if we feel there are things they should be doing differently. In Goma or Bukavu with the M23 if we feel there are things they should be doing differently to make sure that civilians are respected. But we don't share the contents of those discussions neither with the media or with anybody else for that matter. Responsibilities for the prosecution of war crimes lie initially with states, potentially with international bodies, but that's not something we're directly involved in. We have teams working all across the different parts of Congo affected by conflict, and for very pragmatic reasons, if people think we're giving information here or there, that's a problem for our staff, so we don't do that.
Difficult balancing act.
They always have to want to play safe, of course.
Yeah, now conversations about conflict can be very difficult and emotionally draining. And here under the Baobab, we like to remember that at the end of the day, we are real people trying to solve massive problems.
Right. That's where the rapid fire question segment comes in, where we get to know the guest on a personal level. In fact, we've been speaking throughout, this time. We've been speaking to the ICRC Deputy Director. But who is he as a person when he's not talking humanitarian activities and so on? That is also what we do under the Baobab.
And I'll begin. What fun childhood adventure kicked off your humanitarian journey?
I was a teacher in Sri Lanka when I left university. I'm not sure it was a childhood thing. And I kind of stumbled a little bit into humanitarian work there, as I enjoyed teaching, but I wanted to do something else. But I wanted to stay in Sri Lanka, so I did.
A teacher? That is so interesting. And favorite Nairobi spot for quick unwind after tough days?
I worked here in Nairobi, 10 years ago, for a year or so, a bit more than a year. I kind of managed to arrive over the weekend, so this time I was very happy to go to Nairobi National Park and see some of the beautiful animals and landscapes there.
I know this one, James. Does your family tease you about saving the world at dinner?
My wife does a lot, incessantly. Yeah.
And how do you normally take it?
I kind of smile and say she's probably right, in part.
And now, what's your hidden talent? Chef, dancer, or a football pundit?
I grew up in London, and the kind of local club was Crystal Palace, so I was very happy they won the FA Cup last year. When I lived in Nairobi, nobody had heard of Crystal Palace, so I kind of support Arsenal as well, if you're allowed two teams. I'm supposed to be neutral, but I think football shouldn't be neutral.
Well, I thought you were an Arsenal supporter, but go-to playlist when you want to recharge when you solo?
I like jazz a lot, so I don't know if you know, or your listeners or viewers, Thelonious Monk is a great jazz pianist, and that's a good one to relax.
Well, dream vacation if ditching deadlines for a week.
I work in Switzerland, and it's like Kenya. It's a very beautiful country, and I'm a big hiker, so walking in the mountains in the summer is a great way of unplugging.
I know this one, James, and it demands your total honesty. Secret hobby that nobody else knows.
Well, I guess I'm going to, on your program, I'm going to breach my secrecy. I kind of like playing chess online with some success sometimes.
How can you make our guests shy like that? That was an amazing one there.
Yeah, definitely. Just to get to know him on the other side as well. Yeah,
that's also what we do under the Baobab. So, and George, back to the real conversation here.
Yes.
When I was listening to the ICRC director, he was making the point very clear that when it comes to persecution, that's not something they do.
Yes, definitely.
And they cannot carry out judicial actions. Mm-hmm. But also, when you see, envoys from the AU or UN, they would say, oh, we are just here to write the reports. So the question really is, how do we measure also as a humanitarian organization, how much has been done in terms of, success on the ground?
I couldn't help it, but, try to inquire from him. Like you're talking about your key mandate being ensuring that the international humanitarian law is adhered to. Mm-hmm. So when there is violation,
what do you know?
What do you do? And what is the measure matrix?
What I can say is that we document cases ourselves, and we really take those very seriously. We're also do our best where there are, individual cases of women or others affected by sexual violence to ensure they get access to medical care, to psychosocial counselling. And I think, again, we do in DR Congo, but in many countries around Africa and around the world, extensive training programs with armed forces so that there's an awareness of humanitarian law and knowledge of it. In general, it's not for the ICRC to say this party is right and this party is wrong, this is a just war, this is an unjust war. Our president is very clear that if during a conflict the parties respect IHL, it's going to be easier to reach ceasefire agreements, it's going to be easier to find lasting political solutions. It's not our job to find them, but obviously we hope, the longer conflicts go on, the more problems there are for the civilian population. Empirically, you can see that where IHL is respected, it's easier to find a lasting end and a happy end to conflict. Where it's disrespected, bitterness and revenge and a sort of cycle of violence makes it much, much more difficult to bring conflict to an end.
Judge, from what we've just heard, it's not really realistic to expect humanitarian bodies like the ICRC to end conflicts on their own. They can't do it on their own. Yes. In the way that peace, like the UN peacekeeping missions or regional security organs could. But should Africans who are involved in conflicts or African countries in armed conflicts expect more from them?
Yes, and this should be the take-home also to our viewer and listener, Mimi. Today, we wanted to know how can organizations like Red Cross deepen their advocacy for international humanitarian law and build stronger coalitions to perhaps end conflicts with African states without compromising on their neutrality.
And would also like to hear from you out there. What do you think about humanitarian bodies? Should they be going beyond supplying food and medicine? And if you care about honest, interesting discussions like this, also uncomfortable discussions sometimes, but necessary conversations, this is the place that you have to be.
Yes, of course, this is the place you have to be, and all you need to do is subscribe to Under the Baobab on YouTube, and also follow us on Spotify,
Apple Podcasts, and wherever you follow your podcast. And this is Under the Baobab, where we always make complex issues personal and relatable.
Definitely. And my name is Okachi. Until next time, many thanks for following.
And I am Mefo. Goodbye.